I am a very sensitive person, sensitive in all respects, but particularly in the unexplained or other activity. I must be very careful of how I write, because if I say something in a demeaning way, it can have a powerful effect. When I was 3, I lived in Pomeroy, Ohio. The house I lived in was an old home and possibly a stopover for the Underground Railroad. Many bad things happened there before we moved in. According to historians and local townspeople, in the early 1900s or possibly the late 1800s, an old recluse had bought the house. It was a beautiful 2-story house with an apartment upstairs and even downstairs, while outside with a top balcony, front porch columns were white with intricate woodwork. This hermit was in his 30s when he bought it, and he had intentions of fixing this place up. However, he suffered from severe depression and threw himself off of the second-floor balcony. The house stood empty for years afterwards. Eventually, in the 1920s, an older woman and her son bought the house and rented the top floor out. This is where it gets a little fuzzy in the details. Either the woman had driven her son to kill her, then commit suicide, or they formed a suicide pact. The woman was found dead several days after her son had died. Her son's body was found less than a mile from the house in a field. Several more years went by, and the house remained empty. It was crumbling and falling into disrepair. Then, an older gentleman moved into the house. He had discovered that there was a gang of thieves and drug addicts living behind the house, up on a hillside. He had turned over information to the police and was found dead by a neighbor several days later. He had been shot through the chest. The house had several occupants after he had died, but it was never occupied for long. We moved in 1977. Things were bad from the minute we had moved in. Cups would come crashing out of the cupboard. Lights would come on and off. Sesame Street would change to a soap opera. Buckets of paint would mysteriously disappear. However, my mom and dad were painting one of the bedrooms peach color, and that paint seemed acceptable because it wouldn't disappear. One night, I was 3. I went over and climbed into bed with my mom and dad. We were both living in both parts of the house, and my bedroom was on one side of the hallway, and my parents' room was on the other side of the hallway. The staircase was in the middle. As I was going across the stairs, I heard someone call my name. I looked down, and there was an old woman standing on the landing, telling me to get back into bed. She was wearing a brown and white thread. It was called a peasant's dress, black and white ring stockings, and had a green scarf tied on her head. She pointed her bony finger at me and told me to be quiet and go back to bed. I ran into my parents' room and then cried. My dad searched the house and found nothing except a coffee mug smashed in the kitchen. He thought my mom had smashed it and just left it for later. Mom looked at it the next day and said it wasn't ours and didn't know where it came from. The next incident happened when we moved to Athens. I was about 19 and just had a baby. I was living in my apartment in the Plains. Nobody told me the history of my apartment, and since the apartments had been built, nothing strange had happened there. I had a spirit. It was an old man who was wonderful. My apartment was the only one that had not been broken into. My daughter's room was either warm in the winter or cool in the summer. This was a natural impossibility. The sun set on my daughter's side of the window, so she always got the last bit of sun, and it should have been toasty in there. It wasn't. It was almost as if we had air conditioning in that room. We did not have air conditioning at all. In the winter, it was hit most brutal because the winds would whip into that side that faced your room. I had proof. One night, after classes, my boyfriend had put my daughter to bed, then went to take a shower. I was sitting on the floor in the living room, working on homework. All of a sudden, I heard footsteps coming down the steps. They stopped when you could see us up the steps. My boyfriend continued with his shower, and figuring he didn't hear anything, I didn't say anything. He came down, and asked why I came upstairs and why was my daughter laughing in bed. I told him that I didn't go upstairs and I have no idea why she was laughing. All of a sudden, we heard footsteps pacing in her room. We went upstairs and looked. There sat my daughter, looking at us like we were stupid and pointing. I felt a presence, but my boyfriend just shook his head and went back downstairs. Later in the year, I was getting ready to go out one night when I kept feeling something watch me and play peekaboo with me. I was the only one in the house. I looked up and saw a shape that eventually turned into a man's form. He looked at me with great pleasure and then left. A few friends later saw him when we returned. He had gone upstairs to use the bathroom, and when they came down, they asked who the guy was in the bedroom. I went upstairs and looked. I thought he was a friend who had come in the back door and went upstairs. As I went into her room, it was warm. I loudly explained that my daughter was at her mama's house and she would be back the next night. He could play then. On several occasions, I felt an uneasiness in the house, like something wasn't right. I would check everything and make sure that someone wasn't in the apartment. It would be, of course, empty. Then I realized the man was very unhappy about something. I would loudly say, "If you want to live here, fine. Just don't scare us or harm us." The feeling would go away. Currently, I'm working in a building that used to be part of a very bad place where many people had died. I have to be careful of what is said or done. Strange things have happened, like light fixtures come crashing out of the ceiling, people laughing when there was no one in the building, and the most strangest one I've heard. Living people experience the strangest mood changes in the oddest places. I have a very good reason to believe this building is spirited by what, at one time, the insane. This event occurred in the late 60s, if my memory serves me correctly. My first husband and I had gotten married a few months before, and with no place to move, we went into my grandfather's house, which at the time had been empty, for the most part, since the early 50s, after my grandmother had passed away. I need to mention also, as a child, I had grown up in the house with my grandparents, so it was like going home for me. But back to the story. After grandmother passed, grandfather always swore he couldn't stay in the house for her yelling at him, touching him to get up, and beating pots and pans. Well, as I was saying, we moved in, and had lived there maybe 3 months, without incidents, at any time, and just went to bed. Just as we were settling into sleep, we felt a slight rumble. Not thinking about it, my husband started to turn out the lights, and if I remember, just as he started, the rumble began again. I remember us asking one another what that noise was. I guess it was me asking, as I recall us thinking a dog had somehow gotten under the house and shaking. Well, within seconds, the whole house began to shake, and the windows actually rattled. I do mean the house was moving, to where we could feel the bed move and see the window curtains move. At the same time, we heard the living room door to the outside fly open. While all this was going on, my husband got up and dressed to go out to see if he could do anything. I remember telling him I will not stay in the house alone, so he walked to the front porch while he went around the house and didn't find a dog or anything. We came in, closed the door, and started to get back in bed, him telling me it had to be a dog. Just as we were lying down, the house began to shake again, and I do mean it shook, as if we were going to fall in. The living room door flew open, the kitchen door flew open, and all the windows rattled. The bed came out from the wall, a few inches away. It was noticeable. At this time, he jumped up, I jumped up. We ran out into the living room, closing the doors, and pushing the furniture up against the doors. Within a few seconds, it was once again over. We sat in the living room and waited to see what would happen next, and when it was quiet for a while, we went back to bed. I didn't sleep at all, but we never heard anything the rest of the night, or ever again. The funny thing is though, while living there still, I had other terrifying experiences that has got me to the realization that something is out there. But what, and where, and how? I'm not sure, but I know it's there. All my life, I've been fascinated with paranormal and true ghost stories, but that had no alteration to what happened to me with my best friend, who has never had any interest or knowledge of hauntings. She tempted me to go to the base in which she lived, with the promise of an authentic, haunted house. I was immediately interested and went out the following weekend. Reading about how dogs seem to have a sixth sense towards paranormal, I brought along my friend's beagle and basset hound. She led me to an old, condemned hospital. It had been on the Air Force Base since the beginning. It was old brick, and the windows were covered with a thick, white plaster. A large indent that looked like it could have been a porch, with no doors, was on the side of the building. Before we went in, my friend called out the name of a captain who had died there. The beagle suddenly froze and stared at a corner. My friend called out another name, and the dog suddenly turned to stare intensely at another corner. Taking the opportunity, we went to the first corner and knocked on the window. Nothing happened. We went to the second corner and lightly knocked. We heard a sound, like a slight shuffling, coming from inside the building. We walked around the house to a new indent. It had a big cement slab that could have been once a porch. We went to the left corner, and we again knocked on the window. A sharp knock immediately sounded from the inside, from the window next to ours. I turned around and saw another indent. My friend muttered something about a little girl, like there was one near. Throughout this, the dogs were stiff and staring at where we heard the knock. I asked my friend about what she'd said, and she said she just felt the presence of someone that to her seemed to be a little girl. I got a weird feeling that I didn't want to go near the next indent at all. The dogs had turned their attention to this new corner and seemed to feel the same way as I did. My friend started to knock and listened on the new indent while I stayed back. I heard a noise from part of the cement slab that I couldn't see. It sounded like someone had heavily drugged their shoe on the cement. I ran over to see nothing. I felt a chilling, cold feeling all over for no reason. My friend told me she felt cold and asked if I felt the same. I did. We came back the next day and went to the first indent, to the window where we'd heard nothing. When my friend knocked, we heard a scream. It sounded like a man, but in a low volume, almost like a tape recorder turned down. It's hard to describe, and it may sound corny, but it sounded pained. I would have thought someone was hurt inside, but it sounded so strange, and like it was right next to us. Fear taking over, we took off. Later, coming back, we went back to the place we associated with the little girl. I went over to a corner and felt overwhelmed by nausea. I reeled over, feeling horribly sick, and my friend practically drugged me out of there. The second I was out, I felt perfectly healthy. My friend said while I was there, she heard soft knocks and clocks ticking in the house. Now that's a story for the ages. I remember one night, when I was about 8 years old, I was always afraid of the dark. Well, not of the dark, but of things I couldn't see or hear. I've always been a terrible sleeper, even when that young, so I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked around my room. As I always did, I was always scared that I would see something, but I never did until that night. There was a good-looking young man with long straight brown hair and a tux. Beside him was an enormous husky. They both just stood there and stared at me as I looked at them with 1,000 questions running through my head. As I kept staring at them, the man slowly nodded and the dog looked up at him. Then they both just slowly faded away. It is an experience that I'll never forget. No one has died in my house, as my parents bought it as soon as it had been built. I was not scared, but just felt kindred to the ghosts. My name is Brenda, and I have 3 stories to share with you. They'll be in condensed form, but all 3 happened. Most people can't remember much before the age of 5. I remember something that happened when I must have been between the ages of 3 and 4. I know it was around that age because I was still in a crib, and even though I am over 40, I still remember it as if it were last night. I remember that if I didn't fall asleep facing the wall, every night, a little ghost wearing a different necktie would come in and stay beside my crib and stare at me. I know this sounds idiotic, but I can still remember, in fact still do, fall asleep facing the wall. I never saw it otherwise. The next one was when I was 19 and married. We bought an old house that had a room in it that made me feel uncomfortable. My great aunt told me that the house had a reputation about it, and now I know why. I was asleep one night, and my husband was working night shift. Something woke me up, and it was a gorgeous summer night. My husband talked me into making our bedroom in the room that made me feel odd, and I did so to please him. When I woke up, I heard a rustling sound, like somebody rummaging through a paper bag. I sat up in bed, and when I did, a bag of quilt pieces that had belonged to my great-grandmother and I lifted 5 to 6 inches off the dresser where I had set it the night before and floated about 2 feet over the edge and fell. Just as I was getting up to try and see what could have caused that, I heard my name whispered in my ear. I sat the rest of the night on the porch, waiting for my husband to get home, and the next day, moved our bedroom. That seemed to be the only room in the house that felt odd. The third one is about the house we lived in Indianapolis. My daughter was 3 when we moved in, and she constantly talked to someone we couldn't see. She called the spirits Big John and Auntie. We thought maybe it was invisible playmates, until one night, when she was 4, she told me goodbye instead of good night. I said, "Don't you mean good night?" I still remember her sweet baby face say, "No, I mean goodbye." Auntie said she was coming to walk on the stairs tonight. It wasn't until then that she told me that Auntie gets in bed with her at night, and she wears a long white dress and feels like ice. I knew immediately that this was a spirit. I began to cry and told her she couldn't go. She looked at me with her sweet little face and said, "Now that you know Mommy, she won't take me. Big John told me to tell you about her." I believe that Big John was there to watch over her and make sure that Auntie didn't take her to God knows where, but to make sure she slept with me and my husband until we could move from that awful place. I never saw anything there, but I heard plenty. My daughter is 17 now and still remembers the experience. Since I was little, I've had an obsession with the paranormal. I guess this started because my mother was the same way. But my first real paranormal experience happened when I was about 4 years old. I would wake up and I would feel so free. I would look down and realize that I was floating, and I could see myself down below, still sleeping. My mother later described the same thing happening to her when I mentioned it. I also had a reoccurring dream of a goat chasing me through my house, and right before I reached my bedroom, it would impale me on its horns. I would wake up so terrified. The other thing that happened was that my mother and I would hear voices. They came from the wall between the living room and my room. Sometimes they were louder and more frightening than others, especially if we were alone. The voices still can be heard this very day, from time to time. And a few months ago, I came home from work to have my mother tell me that there had been a loud bang, as if someone was slamming a hammer into the side of our mobile home. But there was no sign of anyone or any damage. The other things we've experienced are isolated incidents where our cats would watch as if someone crossing the room, even if no one was there. My mother experienced the feeling of someone sitting on the edge of their bed when she was alone, and I would see shadowy forms out of the corner of my eyes. Another frightening thing is when sometimes at night, the house shakes violently, as if being pummeled by a hurricane. This lasts anywhere from a few seconds to 2 minutes. Many of my other friends in that town were experiencing things out of the ordinary too. We sat outside, discussing it one night, until 4 a.m., we decided maybe our little town is a hotspot. Some saw a short figure, which at first they thought someone was far away with a lit cigarette, but then they realized, as it got closer, it was only the height of a sheepdog, and the glowing red dot was not a cigarette. They ran, and by the time they ventured out to look for it, it was gone. And once at a party, a whole group of my friends saw the apparition of a little girl in a nightgown who fled down the hall when she was noticed. Guys, it's Phantom here, and I'm a little bummed because I edited out something and I just kept redoing it over and over. I'm talking about the outros, of course, but that ends tonight. When darkness hits tonight, it ends tonight. I think that's an American Rejects, but you know what I mean. I'm not an American reject, I'm just a Polish reject. Well, I used to be Polish, but then I became American when I was born here, so that makes me Polish by default. That equation doesn't really add up. Anywho, I'm glad you guys like the stories. I'm assuming you like the stories because I love the stories. Obviously, I picked the stories, so I'm going to love them. Sometimes I don't normally love them, but most of the times I think I do make good stories and I produce them to you and you guys listen and yeah, whoop-de-doo. Again, not going to edit anything out. If you guys, of course, like the stories, go ahead and comment, like, and subscribe. As for me, I guess it's goodbye. So guys, I'll see you in the next video. I love you so very much. Remember to virtually hug me, because you never know when I might disappear like a ghost, and then reappear again for another upload, which means next week I'll be uploading, and also later in this week. Remember guys, next week I'm going to LA, California dreaming. That's what we're gonna do. We're gonna party and vacation all night. Well, you guys are gonna party with a video. I'm gonna have it pre-recorded for you guys, hopefully, and you guys will have a blast. What am I doing? I'm acting so theatrical. Anyway guys, bye-bye.